This story begins in January of 1959. 9 experienced hikers set out on an expedition through the northern Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union. All of them were young, skilled, and familiar with surviving in extreme winter conditions. This wasn't a group of tourists making careless decisions. Most of them were trained hikers with years of experience. Their leader was a 23-year-old engineering student named Igor Dyatlov, and eventually, the place where they died would become known as the Dyatlov Pass. At the time, nobody could have imagined that this trip would become one of the most disturbing, unsolved mysteries in modern history. The group began their journey on January 27, 1959. There were originally 10 members, but one of them turned back early after becoming sick. That decision probably saved his life. The remaining 9 continued deeper into the mountains. The conditions were brutal. Heavy snow, strong winds, freezing temperatures that dropped far below zero. But despite that, the group seemed to be in good spirits. They took photographs along the way, wrote journal entries, joked with each other, and documented parts of the expedition almost casually. That's one of the unsettling parts of this story. When you look at those final photos, nobody seems afraid. Nobody looks like they think something is wrong. And then suddenly, everything changes. The hikers planned to reach a nearby settlement by February 12th and send a telegram to their sports club to confirm they had returned safely. But February 12th came, and no message arrived. At first, nobody panicked. Delays were common during winter expeditions. But after several more days passed with no communication, concerns started to grow. Eventually, search teams were organized. Students and volunteers joined the search first. Then the military became involved. And on February 26th, searchers finally found the group's campsite. What they discovered immediately felt wrong. The tent was partially collapsed under snow. But the most disturbing detail was this. The tent had been cut open from the inside, not unzipped, cut, as if the people inside were desperate to escape as quickly as possible. And then investigators noticed something even stranger. Footprints. Several sets of footprints led away from the tent, down the snowy slope. But many of those footprints were barefoot. Others were wearing only socks. Some appeared to have just a single shoe. Now imagine that for a second. It was the middle of the night in freezing mountain conditions. Temperatures were estimated to be around -30 degrees Celsius. And yet these experienced hikers had suddenly abandoned their shelter without proper clothing. Whatever happened that night, it terrified them enough to run directly into the snow. Searchers followed the tracks. About 1.5 kilometers away from the tent, beneath a large cedar tree, they found the first 2 bodies. The men were barefoot and lightly dressed. One of them appeared to have tried climbing the tree, possibly to look back toward the campsite. Broken branches were found several meters high. It looked like someone had desperately tried to see something in the distance. Nearby, there were signs of a small fire. That detail confused investigators even more. It suggested the hikers had survived for at least some time after fleeing the tent, which raised a horrifying question. If they escaped successfully, why didn't they go back? Over the next several days, more bodies were discovered between the tree and the tent. It almost looked like they had tried to return, as if they suddenly realized they needed to get back to shelter, but never made it. Some had frozen to death, but others showed injuries that didn't make sense. One hiker had severe skull damage. Another had broken ribs so intense that investigators later compared the force to a car crash. And yet, strangely, there were very few external wounds. It was as if something had applied enormous pressure without leaving obvious marks. Then months later, after the snow began melting, the final 4 bodies were discovered in a ravine further into the forest. And this is where the mystery became even darker. One woman was missing her tongue. Others had severe chest fractures. Some clothing showed traces of radiation. And according to reports, several bodies had an unusual orange or darkened skin tone. At that point, theories started spreading everywhere. Some people believed the hikers were attacked. Others thought there had been military involvement, secret weapon testing, avalanches, paranoia. Even supernatural explanations started appearing, because the scene simply didn't feel normal. Why cut open the tent from the inside? Why run into freezing darkness barefoot? Why were some injuries so severe? And why did nobody seem able to fully explain what caused all of this? Over the years, investigators and researchers proposed many theories. One of the most accepted explanations today is a sudden avalanche. The idea is that the hikers heard or felt snow shifting above them and panicked, believing the tent was about to be buried. That could explain why they escaped quickly. But critics argue that the evidence doesn't fully support a major avalanche. The slope angle was relatively low, and the tent was still partially standing when searchers arrived. Another theory involves something called infrasound. Under certain wind conditions, mountains can create extremely low-frequency sound waves that humans can't consciously hear, but can still affect the body and mind. Some researchers believe these sound waves may trigger panic, anxiety, or intense psychological distress. If that happened during the night, it's possible the hikers experienced overwhelming fear and irrational behavior. Others still believe military testing played a role. At the time, there were reports of glowing orange lights seen in the sky near the area. Some think experimental weapons or parachute mines could explain the injuries and radiation traces, but there has never been conclusive evidence. And that's the reason this case still survives today, because every explanation answers some questions, while creating new ones. Even now, more than 60 years later, the Dyatlov Pass Incident continues to disturb people, not just because 9 people died, but because their final moments feel impossible to fully understand. Imagine being inside that tent that night, the wind outside, the freezing darkness beyond the fabric walls, and then suddenly, something happens, something serious enough that 9 experienced. Hikers decide that running half-dressed into a deadly snowstorm is somehow safer than staying where they are. That thought alone is terrifying, and maybe that's why this story refuses to disappear, because even after decades of investigation, we still don't know what those hikers were so afraid of. And whatever happened on that mountain, they never got the chance to explain it.